In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a priceless Stradivarius vanishes moments before Clara Vane's grand Vespers concert, plunging the church into chaos. A trail of glittering clusery beads, a velvet thread, and a hidden violin leads Miss Jane Marple to unravel a cunning plot. Was it a daring theft, or something more personal? As whispers of jealousy and scandal swirl, Miss Marple's keen eye reveals a truth hidden in plain sight, a desperate bid for fame, orchestrated by the violinist herself. In this elegant mystery, every note conceals a secret, and only one mind can find the harmony in deception. Chapter 1. The eve of Vespers. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobbled lanes of St. Mary Mead, gilding the ancient stone of St. Anselm's Church with a warm amber glow. The village, nestled in its sleepy corner of England, hummed with an unusual energy, for the annual Vespers concert was mere hours away. This year, the event promised to be extraordinary, owing to the return of Miss Clara Vane, a daughter of the village who had risen to fame as a violinist of rare brilliance. Her Stradivarius, a legend in its own right, was said to sing with a voice that could move angels to tears. The prospect of hearing it in the modest confines of St. Anselm's had set tongues wagging from the Blue Boar Inn to the post office. Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed pew, third from the front on the left, her knitting needles clicking softly in rhythm with her thoughts. Her eyes, bright and sharp despite her years, surveyed the bustling preparations with quiet amusement. The vicar, Mr. Clement, darted about, his cassock flapping as he directed the placement of hymnals and candelabras. Choir boys, their faces scrubbed to an unnatural pink, giggled and shoved one another until Mrs. Price, the florist, shooed them away from her carefully arranged lilies. Above it all, Clara Vane stood near the chancel, her slender figure swathed in a deep green velvet gown that shimmered faintly in the candlelight. She clutched her violin case, its polished leather gleaming, and her expression was one of poised intensity, though Miss Marple noted a curious flicker in her gazer, darting glance toward the shadowed arches of the nave. "My dear Miss Vane, you must be quite thrilled to perform for us," Mr. Clement said, his round face beaming as he approached her. "It's not every day St. Mary Mead hosts a talent of your caliber." Clara smiled, a practiced curve of her lips that did not quite reach her eyes. "It's an honor to return home, Mr. Clement. This concert's the performance of a lifetime." Her voice was rich, almost theatrical, yet there was a tremor beneath it, like a tightly strung wire. She adjusted her grip on the violin case, her fingers lingering on the clasp, as if reluctant to let it go. Miss Marple's needles paused. She had known Clara as a child-dispirited girl with a flair for drama, always craving the center of attention. Whether in the school play or the Sunday choir, fame had polished her, but not, Miss Marple suspected, changed her. There was something in Clara's manner, restless energy, a hint of calculation that reminded Miss Marple of young Elsie Pratt, who had once staged a fainting spell at a garden party to steal the spotlight from a rival. People, Miss Marple often thought, were so very predictable. The church doors swung open, admitting a gust of cool evening air, and Mrs. Hartnell, the manor's formidable mistress and Clara's host for the week. Her tweed suit rustled as she strode in, her voice carrying over the chatter. "Clara, my dear, you mustn't overtear yourself before the performance. Come, let's ensure everything is in order." Clara nodded, her smile tightening, and followed Mrs. Hartnell to the vestry, where her dresser, Miss Lydia Finch, waited with a bundle of sheet music and a nervous air dot. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind turning over the scene. She noted the choir boys whispering behind the organ, the sexton, Mr. Grubb, polishing the brass candlesticks with unnecessary vigour, and the faint scent of incense mingling with the lily's perfume. Most of all, she noted Clara's violin case, never far from her side, and the way her eyes swept the church as if searching for something or guarding against it. Curious, Miss Marple murmured to herself, her needles clicking once more. The Vespers concert promised music, but Miss Marple sensed another performance was already unfolding, one that might prove far more intriguing. Chapter 2. The Disappearance, the Vaulted Ceiling of St. Anselm's. Church seemed to hold its breath as the congregation settled into their pews, the air heavy with the mingled scents of beeswax candles, polished wood, and the faint tense of anticipation. The Vespers concert, a highlight of St. Mary Mead's modest social calendar, had drawn a crowd that overflowed the ancient stone walls. Villagers in their Sunday best rubbed shoulders with a smattering of outsiders' music enthusiasts from neighbouring towns. Drawn by the allure of Clara Vane's Stradivarius, the instrument, whispered to be worth a king's ransom, was said to produce notes so pure they could pierce the heart. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual spot, her knitting tucked discreetly in her lap, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of quiet curiosity and sharp discernment. Her eyes, bright as a sparrow's, flitted from face to face, noting the eager whispers, the rustle of programs, and the occasional sidelong glance toward the vestry door, where Clara Vane was expected to emerge. The church clock struck 7, its chimes reverberating through the nave. Mr. Clement, the vicar, stood at the pulpit, his round face flushed with a mixture of pride and nerves. "Dear friends," he began, his voice carrying a touch of tremor, "tonight we are privileged to hear Miss Clara Vane, our own prodigy, whose music has graced the finest halls of Europe. Let us welcome her with the warmth of our village." Applause rippled through the congregation, polite but fervent, as heads turned toward the vestry. The door remained closed. A moment passed, then another, and a faint murmur stirred among the pews. Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their soft clicking, paused. She leaned slightly toward Mrs. Price, the florist, seated beside her. "Is Miss Vane often late, I wonder?" she asked, her tone mild. Mrs. Price, whose florid hat bobbed with her indignation, whispered back, "She's a professional, Miss Marple. Surely she wouldn't keep us waiting." Yet the delay stretched, and the murmurs grew louder. Mr. Clement, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, signalled to the organist, Mr. Tuttle, who launched into an impromptu hymn to fill the silence. The congregation shifted restlessly, their anticipation curdling into unease. Then, from the vestry, came a sound that froze every heart, a piercing, anguished cry. "It's gone. My violin, it's gone." The door burst open, and Clara Vane stumbled into the chancel, her face ashen, her green velvet gown dishevelled. In her hands she clutched an empty violin case, its velvet lining starkly bare. The congregation gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the church. Clara's eyes, wide with apparent horror, swept over the crowd. Someone's stolen it, she wailed, collapsing onto a nearby chair as Mrs. Hartnell rushed to her side. Her tweed-clad figure, a bulwark of authority, Constable Hurst, stationed near the church door for the occasion, pushed his way through the crowd, his heavy boots echoing on the stone floor. Now, what's all this?" he demanded, his moustache bristling with officious zeal. "Miss Vane, are you certain it's been stolen?" Clara nodded, her hands trembling as she gestured to the empty case. I left it in the vestry, just for a moment, to tune it. I stepped out to speak with Lydia Miss Finch, my dresser, and, when I returned, it was gone. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, a picture of despair that drew sympathetic murmurs from the onlookers. Miss Marple, unmoved by the theatrics, watched closely. She noted the way Clara's fingers clutched the case, not with the desperation of loss, but with a certain stiffness, as if the gesture had been rehearsed. She also observed Mr. Clement, hovering helplessly, and Miss Finch, who lingered at the vestry door, her thin face pale and her hands twisting nervously in her apron. The constable, meanwhile, took charge with the ponderous efficiency of a man who preferred simple solutions. "Right then," he declared. "No one leaves this church until we've searched every inch. This is a theft, plain and simple. Some chancers made off with it, but they won't get far." He barked orders to Mr. Grubb, the sexton, to lock the side doors and stationed young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, at the main entrance. The congregation, now a captive audience, buzzed with speculation. Mrs. Price leaned toward Miss Marple again, her voice low. "A Stradivarius, stolen. It's worth more than my shop, I'll wager. Who'd dare such a thing in St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes still fixed on Clara. "People will dare a great deal, Mrs. Price, when they want something badly enough, when they wish to make a point." Her words were soft, almost lost in the clamour, but her mind was already sifting through the scene, cataloguing details with the precision of a jeweller examining a gem. Constable Hurst began his investigation with a heavy-handed sweep of the vestry, a small room cluttered with hymnals, vestments, and a chipped mirror where Clara had adjusted her gown. "Nothing here but dust and prayer books," he grumbled, emerging to address the crowd. "Miss Vane, when exactly did you leave the violin unattended?" Clara, now seated in the chancel with Mrs. Hartnell fanning her, lifted her head. "It was just after 6:30, she said, her voice steadier now. "I placed the case on the table, tuned the violin briefly, then stepped out to speak with Lydia about my music. I wasn't gone more than 5 minutes." Her eyes darted to Miss Finch, who nodded vigorously, though her expression remained strained. Miss Marple, rising from her pew with the slow deliberation of age, approached the vestry door. The constable, preoccupied with questioning Mr. Tuttle about suspicious loiterers, paid her no mind. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. The table where Clara claimed to have left the violin was bare, save for a few sheets of music and a small brass candlestick. But on the floor, near the door, something caught the candlelight, a single amber rosary bead, its surface smooth and faintly luminous. Miss Marple bent, with some effort, and retrieved it, slipping it into her handkerchief. She straightened, her gaze falling on the doorway itself, where a faint smudge of silvery glitter marked the frame, as if someone had brushed against it. In haste, returning to the nave, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her mind turning over the clues. Rosary beads were uncommon in St. Mary Mead, a village of staunch Protestant traditions, though Miss Finch was known for her quiet devotion and might carry such an item. The glitter, however, was more puzzling. It was not the sort one found in a church, unless perhaps from a child's craft or a theatrical costume. Miss Marple's thoughts flickered to Clara's gown, which shimmered subtly in the light, but she recalled no such glitter on its fabric. She glanced at Clara, now surrounded by a knot of villagers offering tea and sympathy. The violinist's distress seemed genuine, yet there was a quality to it, a certain polish that reminded Miss Marple of the village theatricals, where emotions were amplified for effect. Constable Hurst, meanwhile, had begun questioning the choir boys, who protested their innocence with wide-eyed vigour. "We was in the loft, sir, practising," piped up young Billy Stokes, his freckled face earnest. "Didn't see nothing but hymnals." Mr. Grubb, the sexton, offered a gruff report of locking the church at 5, though he admitted to stepping out briefly to fetch his pipe from the shed. "No one could have got in without me seeing," he insisted, though his rheumy eyes suggested otherwise. The constable, growing frustrated, announced a search of the pews, enlisting Mr. Tuttle and Mrs. Hartnell's footman to assist. The congregation submitted reluctantly, their murmurs turning to indignation as bags and coats were inspected. Miss Marple, excused from the search due to her age and reputation, watched the proceedings with quiet interest. She noted the way eyes followed the constable's movements, not with fear but with a curious intensity, as if gauging his progress. She also observed Miss Finch, who had retreated to a corner, her hands still twisting in her apron. The dresser's nervousness seemed disproportionate, though whether from guilt or mere anxiety, Miss Marple could not yet say her thoughts were interrupted by Mrs. Hartnell, who swept past, muttering about the scandal of it all. "A theft in St. Anselm's. It's unheard of. Clara's devastated, poor dear. That violin was her life." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but her mind sharp. "It's a great loss, though I wonder if it's quite as lost as it seems." Mrs. Hartnell, too distracted to catch the implication, bustled off to confer with the vicar. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the vestry door, where the glitter smudge lingered in her memory. She thought of the rosary bead in her handkerchief, its amber glow a small but significant detail. People, she reflected, were often careless with their secrets, leaving trails as clear as breadcrumbs to those who knew where to look. The search yielded nothing, no violin, no suspicious bundles, only a few misplaced hymnals and a child's lost glove. Constable Hurst, his face reddening, declared a temporary halt. "We'll resume at first light," he announced. "No one's to touch the vestry till then." He posted Tommy Pierce at the door, a dubious sentinel given the boy's penchant for mischief, and dismissed the congregation with a stern warning to report any sightings of strangers. The villagers dispersed, their excitement tempered by unease, whispering of thieves and London gangs as they spilled into the chilly night. Clara, escorted by Mrs. Hartnell, left for the manor, her empty violin case a poignant prop. Miss Marple lingered, offering to help Mr. Clement tidy the hymnals, though her true purpose was to observe the church in its quiet aftermath. As the vicar locked the vestry, she paused by the pew where Clara had sat before her performance was to begin. There, in the candlelight, she saw it again, a faint scattering of glitter, silvery and fine, dusting the polished wood. She touched it lightly, her fingers coming away with a delicate shimmer. "Very curious indeed," she murmured, her eyes narrowing. The concert had been postponed. The village was in an uproar, and yet Miss Marple felt a familiar stir of certainty. The violin's disappearance was no simple theft, but a puzzle with threads she was only beginning to unravel as she stepped into the night. Her shawl drawn close against the autumn chill, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Clara Vane. The violinist's cry had been convincing, her distress a masterpiece of emotion. Yet there was something in her manner, flicker of artifice, that Miss Marple could not ignore. She recalled a similar incident years ago, when a young woman in the village had claimed her brooch stolen, only to be found wearing it at a dance, having orchestrated the drama to win sympathy. People, Miss Marple said softly to herself, do so love to be noticed. With the rosary bead and glitter tucked in her mind as carefully as in her handkerchief, she made her way home, certain that St. Anselm's held more secrets than a missing Stradivarius. Chapter 3. The First Clues. The morning after the Vespers debacle dawned crisp and golden, with mist curling gently over the meadows of St. Mary Mead. The village, however, was far from serene. The theft of Clara Vane's Stradivarius had ignited a firestorm of gossip that crackled from the butcher's shop to the tea room, each villager adding their own embellishment to the tale. By breakfast, the story had grown from a daring theft to a conspiracy involving shadowy London criminals, or, as Mrs. Price breathlessly suggested, a rival musician's revenge. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her cottage window with a cup of tea, listened to the chatter filtering through her open door, her expression one of mild amusement tempered by keen interest. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, for her mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of the previous evenings. Drama. St. Anselm's Church, bathed in the soft light of morning, stood as the epicenter of the village's agitation. Constable Hurst, his moustache bristling with determination, had commandeered the vestry as his makeshift headquarters, his broad frame filling the doorway as he barked orders to a reluctant Mr. Grubb. We'll turn this place upside down if we must, he declared, his voice carrying across the churchyard where a small crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity and the promise of scandal. Miss Marple, arriving under the pretense of returning a misplaced hymnal, slipped into the nave with her usual unobtrusive grace. Her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, took in the scene, the choir boys loitering near the organ, whispering excitedly, Mrs. Hartnell conferring with Mr. Clement in hushed tones, and Clara Vane, seated in a pew, her face pale but composed, wrapped in a shawl that seemed more theatrical prop than necessity. The constable's investigation, Miss Marple noted, was a study in bluster over substance. He had questioned the choir boys again, extracting nothing beyond their insistence that they'd been too busy dodging Mr. Tuttle's in rehearsals to notice anything amiss. Mr. Grubb, still smarting from the implication that he'd left the church unlocked, repeated his tale of securing the doors at 5, though his memory faltered when pressed about the exact timing of his pipe-fetching errand. I was only gone a minute, sir, he grumbled, his gnarled hands twisting his cap. Constable Hurst, undeterred, announced plans to search the churchyard and interrogate every villager who'd been near St. Anselm's the previous evening. A thief doesn't vanish into thin air, he said, with the confidence of a man who'd preferred his mysteries straightforward. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily satisfied. She approached the vestry door, where the constable was momentarily distracted by a choir boy's claim of a suspicious shadow in the churchyard. Slipping inside, she examined the small room with the meticulous care of one accustomed to finding significance in the overlooked. The table where Clara had claimed to leave her violin was still bare, its surface polished to a dull sheen, unmarred by scratches or marks that might suggest a struggle. The candlestick, hymnals, and mirror remained as they had been, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the floor near the doorway. There, where she had found the amber rosary bead the previous night, the stone was clean, as if someone had swept it since. She knelt, her joints protesting, and peered closely. A faint trace of dust in the corners suggested no such cleaning had occurred elsewhere, which made the spot's pristine state all the more curious. Rising, she moved to the doorway itself, where the smudge of silvery glitter she had noticed last night still clung to the frame. She touched it lightly, her gloved finger collecting a delicate shimmer. It was fine, almost powdery, unlike the coarse sequins of a child's craft or the metallic sheen of Mrs. Hartnell's brooch. Miss Marple tucked a sample into her handkerchief alongside the rosary bead and stepped back into the nave. Her eyes fell on the pew where Clara had sat briefly before entering the vestry, and there too she found a scattering of the same glitter, faint but unmistakable, dusting the polished wood like frost. She made a mental note of its position, near the armrest where Clara's sleeve might have brushed, and resolved to examine the violinist's gown at the earliest opportunity. Clara, meanwhile, was the centre of a sympathetic circle, Mrs. Price. Her hat, now adorned with an extra ribbon in solidarity, pressed a cup of tea into her hands. "You poor dear," she clucked. "To lose such a treasure. It's a crime against art itself." Clara's response was a wan smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not just the violin," she said, her voice low but carrying. "It's a part of me, my voice. Without it, I'm nothing." The words, delivered with a tremor, drew murmurs of pity, but Miss Marple, observing from a distance, noted the careful modulation of Clara's tone, the way her hands gestured just so, as if addressing an audience rather than a handful of villagers, approaching with her characteristic diffidence. Miss Marple settled beside Clara, her knitting bag a comforting prop. "My dear," she said gently, "this must be a dreadful shock. Can you tell me exactly what happened? Every detail might help, you know." Clara's eyes flickered a momentary hesitation that Miss Marple caught but did not remark upon. "It was so sudden," Clara began, her voice steadying. "I went to the vestry to tune my violin. It's a delicate thing, you see, and the church's dampness can affect the strings. I set the case on the table, opened it, and played a few notes. Then Lydia called me to discuss the order of my pieces, so I stepped out for just a moment. When I returned, the case was empty." She shuddered, pressing a hand to her cheek. "I can't believe someone would do this." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly concern, though her mind was cataloguing discrepancies. "And you saw no one else in the vestry? No one lingered nearby?" Clara shook her head, her curls catching the light. "No one, Miss Marple. It was just me and Lydia, and she was outside the whole time." Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking, a rhythm that belied the intensity of her thoughts. Lydia Finch, Clara's dresser, was a figure of interest, not least because of the rosary bead. But Clara's account, so smoothly delivered, had the polish of a rehearsed speech, and Miss Marple had learned to distrust such perfection as the morning wore on. Constable Hurst's search of the churchyard proved fruitless, yielding only a discarded sweet wrapper and a crow's feather. The villagers, growing restless, began to disperse, though not without casting curious glances at Clara, who remained in her pew, accepting condolences with a grace that bordered on regal. Miss Marple, however, lingered, her attention drawn to the alcove where the choir robes were stored. It was a cramped space, half hidden behind a pillar, and she recalled the faint rustling young Tommy Pierce had mentioned hearing in the loft. Approaching with care, she examined the robes, their heavy folds undisturbed at first glance. But as she lifted a surplice, something rolled out and clinked softly on the stone floor, another amber rosary bead, identical to the first. Miss Marple retrieved it, her fingers deft despite her age, and held it to the light. Its warm glow was unmistakable, and its presence in such an out-of-the-way spot was no accident. She considered Lydia Finch, whose devotion was well known, but also Clara, who had been in the vestry longer than her account suggested. The beads, she mused, might be a deliberate misdirection, or perhaps a careless oversight by someone unused to such props. Tucking the second bead into her handkerchief, she made her way to the churchyard, where the crowd had thinned to a few stragglers. There, she encountered Mr. Tuttle, the organist, polishing his glasses with a nervous air. "A bad business, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "I was at the organ all evening, but I didn't see a thing. Too busy keeping the boys in line." Miss Marple smiled, her tone encouraging. "You have a keen ear, Mr. Tuttle. Did you hear anything unusual? A footstep, perhaps, or a door creaking?" He frowned, then hesitated. "Well, now you mention it, there was a sort of scuffle in the vestry just before Miss Vane's cry. I thought it was her moving the table, but it might have been something else." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind adding this to her growing tapestry of clues. Returning to the nave, she paused by Clara's pew once more, her eyes drawn to the glitter. It was sparse, but its presence suggested a connection to the vestry, where the same shimmer marked the doorway. She considered the possibility of a costume, perhaps Clara's gown, though she recalled its velvet sheen as free of such adornment. The violinist's sleeves, however, were voluminous, and Miss Marple made a note to inspect them closely. She also thought of the church's other visitors, the choir boys, Mr. Grubb, even Mrs. Hartnell, who had been in and out before the concert. Yet none seemed likely to carry glitter, a substance more suited to the stage than St. Mary Mead's. Sober confines. As noon approached, Constable Hurst emerged from the vestry, his face a mask of frustration. "Nothing," he announced to Mr. Clement, who hovered anxiously nearby. "Not a trace of that violin. I'll have to call in the county police if we don't find it soon." The vicar wrung his hands. "Oh dear, the scandal. Poor Miss Vane will be heartbroken." Miss Marple, overhearing, kept her counsel, but her thoughts were far from the constable's bluster. The violin's absence was no random act, she was certain, but a carefully orchestrated move in a game she was only beginning to understand. Slipping out into the churchyard, Miss Marple paused by the lych gate, her gaze sweeping the village beyond. St. Mary Mead, with its thatched cottages and tidy gardens, seemed an unlikely stage for such a drama. Yet she knew better than most that even the quietest places harboured secrets. The rosary beads, the glitter, Clara's polished pointed to a puzzle with layers yet to be peeled back. She recalled a similar incident in her youth, when a girl had hidden her own necklace to spark a village uproar, only to find it later to great acclaim. "People," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes twinkling, "do so love to be the centre of things." With the beads and glitter safe in her handkerchief, she set off for the manor, determined to observe Clara Vane more closely. For the violinist, she suspected, held the key to the mystery's heart. Chapter 4. The village suspects the sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, its rays piercing the morning mist to bathe the village in a deceptive calm. The theft of Clara Vane's Stradivarius had stirred the quiet hamlet into a frenzy of speculation, transforming the usual rhythm of gossip into a cacophony of theories and accusations. By midday, the Blue Boar Inn was crowded with villagers swapping tales over pints, while the post office buzzed with whispers of intrigue. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her neat parlour with a second cup of tea, listened to the distant hum of chatter filtering through her open window. Her knitting lay untouched, for her mind was occupied with the puzzle of the missing violin, its pieces scattered like the stitches of an unravelled shawl. The rosary beads and glitter, safely tucked in her handkerchief, were clues that demanded context, and she resolved to immerse herself in the village's ferment to find its St. Mary Mead. for all its sleepy charm, was a place where secrets seldom stayed buried. The theft had unleashed a torrent of suspicion, each villager eager to pin the crime on an outsider or a rival. At the butcher's shop, Mr. Pierce, his apron stained with the morning's work, declared it the act of a London gang drawn by the violin's fabled value. "Mark my words," he said, brandishing a cleaver for emphasis. They slipped in during the chaos and slipped out with the prize. His son Tommy nodded sagely, though his eyes gleamed with the thrill of being near the drama. Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, had a different theory. Whispered to anyone who bought a stamp, "It's that cellist from Much Benham, jealous of Miss Vane's fame. I heard he was in the village last week, snooping about." Even the choir boys, loitering outside the church, spun tales of a ghostly figure haunting the churchyard. A story Miss Marple dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations, and too many sweets stopped Miss Marple, stepping out into the village, moved with the unhurried grace of one who knew the value of observation. Her first stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was presiding over a tray of scones and a pot of tea for a small gathering of parishioners. The room was thick with indignation, and Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, to listen. Mrs. Price, her hat now adorned with a second ribbon in a show of loyalty to Clara, was in full flow. "It's a disgrace," she declared, her voice quivering with outrage, "to think someone would steal from a church, and from Miss Vane, no less. She's a treasure, that girl, and her violin, why, it's practically sacred." Mrs. Hart, seated stiffly in her tweed, nodded in agreement, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of impatience with the florist's histrionics. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was sifting through the conversation for grains of truth. "It is a shocking thing," she agreed, her voice soft. "But I wonder, Mrs. Clement, if anyone saw anything unusual before the concert. A stranger, perhaps, or someone out of place." Mrs. Clement, flustered by the role of hostess and sleuth, shook her head. "Oh, Miss Marple, it was such a busy evening. People were coming and going. Boys the sexton, Miss Finch, of course, fussing over Clara's gown. I didn't notice anything odd, but then I was so preoccupied with the hymnals." Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the mention of Lydia Finch, whose rosary beads were a persistent thread in the mystery. The conversation turned to Mr. Grubb, the sexton, whose tale of a shadowy figure in the churchyard had taken on mythic proportions. "He swears he saw someone near the yew trees at dusk," Mrs. Price said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "A tall figure," he said, cloaked in black. "It's positively sinister." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to her thoughts. Mr. Grubb's eyesight, she knew, was as reliable as a cracked lens, and his penchant for embellishment rivaled that of the village's amateur dramatists. Still, the story warranted investigation, if only to rule out fancy. She thanked Mrs. Clement for the tea and made her way to the church, where the air of scandal still lingered. Eston Anselm's was quieter now, the morning's surge having dispersed the curious. Constable Hurst was nowhere to be seen, likely at the Blue Boar, fortifying himself for another round of fruitless inquiries. Miss Marple slipped into the churchyard, her eyes scanning the yew trees, where Mr. Grubb claimed to have seen his phantom. The ground was soft from recent rain, but no footprints marred the grass, only the scuff marks of the sexton's own boots. She paused, considering. A figure in the churchyard might have been a distraction, or perhaps a figment of Mr. Grubb's imagination, fueled by the excitement of the evening. Yet the absence of evidence was itself a clue, suggesting the theft had occurred within the church's walls, where the rosary beads and glitter pointed to a more intimate culprit inside the church. Miss Marple returned to the pew where Clara had sat, the faint shimmer of glitter still visible in the morning light. She knelt, her joints protesting, and examined the floor beneath, finding a few more specks scattered like stardust. The glitter, she mused, was not the sort found in a village church, where plain fabrics and practical shoes were the norm. It suggested something theatrical, perhaps a costume or prop, and her thoughts turned again to Clara's gown. The violinist had worn velvet, rich and unadorned, but her sleeves were wide, capable of concealing a dusting of glitter from some earlier contact. Miss Marple made a mental note to visit the manor where Clara was staying, to inspect the gown more closely. Her reverie was interrupted by young Tommy Pierce, who bounded into the church with the energy of a puppy. "Miss Marple," he called, his freckled face alight with excitement. "I remembered something. I heard a rustling in the loft last night, before Miss Vane screamed. I thought it was bats, but maybe it was the thief." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind but searching. "That's very helpful, Tommy. Did you see anyone go up to the loft?" The boy shook his head, his enthusiasm undimmed. "No, ma'am, but I wasn't looking. I was too busy dodging Billy Stokesy pinched my hymn book." Miss Marple thanked him, filing away the rustling as another thread to tug, though she suspected it was more likely the choir boy's mischief than a thief's stealth. Her next stop was the village shop, where Mrs. Weatherby held court behind the counter, her sharp tongue slicing through the morning's gossip. "It's that cellist, I tell you," she said to a customer as Miss Marple entered. "He was here last week, asking about the concert. Jealous, that's what he is. Miss Vane's star shines too bright for some." Miss Marple, selecting a packet of tea, listened with half an ear. The cellist, a Mr. Hargreaves from Much Benham, was known to her as a mild-mannered man with little flair for crime. Still, she asked, did Mr. Hargreaves seem particularly interested in Miss Vane's violin? Mrs. Weatherby pursed her lips. He asked about her program and whether she'd play the Stradivarius. Seemed a bit too curious, if you ask me. Miss Marple nodded, unconvinced but unwilling to dismiss any lead. As she left the shop, she encountered Mr. Tuttle, the organist, trudging toward the church with a stack of sheet music. His glasses slipped down his nose, and he looked harried, as if the theft had disrupted his carefully ordered world. "Good morning, Mr. Tuttle," Miss Marple said, her tone inviting confidence. "This business with the violin must be quite upsetting for you." He sighed, adjusting his glasses. "It's a disruption, Miss Marple. The choir's all at sixes and sevens, and Mr. Clements beside himself. I didn't see anything, though I heard that scuffle in the vestry, as I told you. Could have been Miss Vane moving things, but it was odd, now I think of it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And where were you when you heard it?" She asked. "At the organ, keeping the boys from climbing the pipes," he replied. "I didn't look toward the vestry, too busy." She thanked him, her mind turning over the scuffle, which suggested movement, perhaps hurried, in the moments. Before Clara's cry, by afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the manor, where Clara was staying under Mrs. Hartnell's formidable protection. The manor, a rambling pile of stone and ivy, was abuzz with activity as servants prepared for a small gathering to console the violinist. Miss Marple, invited as a courtesy to her status in the village, arrived with her knitting bag, her presence as unassuming as a shadow. Clara, seated in the drawing room, was the picture of fragile resilience, her eyes red-rimmed, but her posture composed. She wore a different gown now, a soft grey silk that clung to her frame, and Miss Marple noted the absence of glitter on its sleeves. "Miss Vane," she said, settling beside her, "you must be dreadfully shaken. Have you recalled anything new about last night?" Clara's smile was faint, almost wistful. "Only that I was careless," she said. "I should never have left the violin alone. But who could imagine such a thing in St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple's needles clicked, a soothing rhythm that belied her probing thoughts. "Indeed," she said, "but sometimes the unimaginable is exactly what someone intends." Clara's eyes flickered, a fleeting shadow crossing her face, but she said nothing more. Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the careful way she arranged her hands, the slight tension in her shoulders. The violinist was a performer, not just of music but of emotion, and Miss Marple had seen such performances before, calculated to captivate, to deflect, to conceal. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Hartnell ushered the guests to tea, her voice booming with authority. "We must rally around Miss Vane," she declared. "This village will not be cowed by thieves." The guests murmured agreement, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She slipped away to the corridor leading to Clara's room, where Miss Finch, the dresser, was folding linens. "Miss Finch," Miss Marple said, her tone kindly, "you were with Miss Vane before the concert. Did you notice anything unusual?" In the vestry, Lydia's hands stilled, her face paling. "No, ma'am," she said, too quickly. "I was just arranging her music and gown. I didn't see anything." Miss Marple smiled, noting the nervous twitch of Lydia's fingers. "And your rosary?" she asked gently. "You didn't misplace it, did you?" Lydia's eyes widened, but she shook her head. "I keep it in my pocket, ma'am. I wouldn't leave it lying about." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind turning over the dresser's unease, the rosary beads, the glitter, the scuffle in the vestibule pointed to a drama staged within the church, not beyond it. She recalled a long-ago incident in the village, when a young man had hidden his own watch to accuse a rival, only to be caught when the watch was found in his own coat. "People," she murmured, stepping back into the drawing room, "do so love to complicate things." The village suspects, from Mr. Grubb's shadowy figure to Mrs. Weatherby's jealous cellist, were distractions, she suspected, from a truth. Closer to home, with the glitter and beads as her guide, Miss Marple resolved to watch Clara Vane. For the violinist's performance, she felt certain, was far from over. Chapter 5. The Glitter Trail. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green and bathing St. Anselm's Church in a soft, golden haze. The fervour over Clara Vane's stolen Stradivarius showed no sign of abating. If anything, the mystery had tightened its grip on the village, weaving itself into every conversation, from the blacksmith's forge to the tea-room's lace-curtained windows. Theories multiplied like dandelions, each more fanciful than the last, yet none, to Miss Jane Marple's discerning mind, held the weight of truth. She sat in her cottage, her tea cooling beside her, her knitting needles silent as she turned over the clues that had begun to form a pattern, the amber rosary beads, the silvery glitter, and the curious polish of Clara's distress. These were not the random leavings of a thief, she felt certain, but threads in a tapestry of deliberate design. Miss Marple's morning had been spent sifting through the villagers' gossip, each rumour a pebble in the stream of her thoughts. She had heard Mr. Pierce's renewed insistence on a London gang. Mrs. Weatherby's fixation on the much Benham cellist, and young Tommy Pierce's breathless tale of rustling in the church loft. Yet it was the physical clues, the beads, and the glitter that anchored her suspicions, pointing not to outsiders, but to someone within the church's intimate circle. The glitter, in particular, intrigued her, its delicate shimmer out of place in the sober confines of St. Anselm's. It suggested a connection to Clara, whose theatrical presence was as much a performance as her music, but Miss Marple needed more than suspicion to unravel the knot. Determined to follow the trail, she donned her hat and shawl and made her way back to St. Anselm's, her steps measured but purposeful. The church was quieter now, the morning's bustle replaced by a stillness broken only by the cooing of pigeons in the rafters. Constable Hurst had retreated to the Blue Boar for lunch, leaving the church in the care of Mr. Grubb, who was sweeping the steps with a vigour that suggested he wished to sweep away the scandal itself. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he grunted, pausing to mop his brow. "No sign of that violin yet. Constable's talking of dragging the pond, but I say it's long gone." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind but probing. "Perhaps, Mr. Grubb, but I wonder, did you notice anything unusual in the church before the concert? A sound, perhaps, or someone out of place?" He scratched his head, his memory as foggy as the morning mist. "Can't say I did, ma'am. Too busy locking up and fetching my pipe. Though I did see Miss Finch fussing about, as usual." Miss Marple thanked him and slipped inside, her gaze drawn to the pew where Clara had sat before her ill-fated trip to the vestry. The glitter, faint but persistent, still dusted the polished wood, a delicate trail that seemed to beckon her onward. She followed it, her eyes scanning the floor, and found that it led toward the vestry door, where the smudge on the frame remained undisturbed. The trail was sparse, a mere scattering of specks, but it was consistent, suggesting movement from the pew to the vestry and perhaps beyond. She paused, considering. The glitter was not the coarse variety used in children's crafts, nor the metallic sheen of jewelry. It was fine, almost ethereal, like the dusting on a costume designed to catch the stage lights. Clara's velvet gown, she recalled, had no such adornment, but her sleeves were wide, capable of brushing against something or concealing it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the church door, and she turned to see Mr. Clement, his car-sack slightly askew, entering with a stack of hymnals. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice weary, "you're a steadfast presence in all this chaos. I fear this theft has shaken our little community." She nodded sympathetically, her mind still on the glitter. "It's a troubling affair, Mr. Clement. Tell me, did you see Miss Vane in the vestry before her performance? Or perhaps Miss Finch?" The vicar frowned, his memory strained. "I was so busy with the congregation, I hardly noticed. Miss Finch was in and out, arranging things for Miss Vane, and I saw Clara there briefly, tuning her violin. She seemed anxious, but I thought it was just nerves." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained gentle. "Anxious," she murmured. "Yes, that's to be expected." She moved toward the vestry, her steps slow but deliberate, and entered the small room once more. The table, mirror, and hymnals were as she had left them, but her attention was drawn to the alcove, where the choir robes hung, their heavy folds casting shadows in the dim light. She recalled finding the second rosary bead there, tucked behind a surplice, and decided to investigate further. Lifting the robes one by one, she examined the fabric for any trace of glitter, but found none. The alcove, however, offered another clue, a faint smudge of glitter on the stone wall, barely visible unless one knew to look. It was at knee height, as if someone had brushed against it while crouching or reaching. Miss Marple knelt, her joints protesting, and peered into the narrow space behind the robes. There, in a crevice where the wall met the floor, was a single strand of green thread, the same rich hue as Clara's gown. She retrieved the thread, holding it to the light. It was velvet, unmistakably, and its presence in such a hidden spot suggested more than a casual brush. Clara had claimed to have been in the vestry only briefly, yet the thread and glitter hinted at movement, perhaps hurried or secretive. Miss Marple tucked the thread into her handkerchief, alongside the rosary beads and glitter sample, and straightened, her mind racing. The alcove was an unlikely place for a violinist to linger, unless she had a purpose hiding something, perhaps, or ensuring it was found later. Miss Marple recalled a case from her youth, when a village girl had hidden her own diary to spark a search, only to discover it to great acclaim. The parallels were striking, and Clara's theatrical flair made such a ruse all too plausible. Leaving the vestry, Miss Marple paused by the organ, where Mr. Tuttle was adjusting the stops with a distracted air. "A bad business, Miss Marple," he said, echoing his earlier sentiment. "The choir's all out of sorts, and Miss Vane's in no state to perform." She nodded, her tone encouraging. "You were at the organ all evening, Mr. Tuttle. Did you see Miss Vane move about the church before her cry?" He shook his head, his glasses slipping. "I was too busy keeping the boys from mischief, but I did see her go to the vestry, and Miss Finch was hovering nearby, carrying on about the music. Seemed a bit flustered, if you ask me." Miss Marple thanked him, noting the mention of Lydia Finch. The dresser's nervousness was a recurring theme, and the rosary beads pointed to her, though whether as culprit or pawn, Miss Marple could not yet say. Her next destination was the manor where Clara was ensconced under Mrs. Hartnell's protective wing. The walk was brisk, the autumn air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves, and Miss Marple used the time to order her thoughts. The glitter trail, from pew to vestry to alcove, suggested a deliberate path, one that Clara or someone close to her had followed. The rosary beads, meanwhile, were a curious anomaly in Protestant St. Mary Mead, and Lydia Finch's devotion made her a likely source, though her role remained unclear. Miss Marple considered the possibility of a staged theft orchestrated to draw attention or deflect it, and Clara's polished distress fit the pattern of a performer craving the spotlight at the manor. Miss Marple was ushered into the drawing room, where Clara sat by a roaring fire, her grey silk gown replaced by a soft wool dress that lent her an air of fragility. Mrs. Hartnell, presiding over a silver tea service, greeted Miss Marple with a nod. "You're a welcome sight, Miss Marple," she said. "This dreadful affair has us all on edge." Clara looked up, her eyes shadowed but composed. "I'm trying to be brave," she said, her voice low, "but without my violin, I feel as if I've lost my soul." The words were poignant, yet Miss Marple detected a practiced cadence, as if Clara were reciting lines for an audience. Settling beside her, Miss Marple offered a sympathetic smile. "It's a terrible loss, my dear, but sometimes the smallest details can lead us to the truth. Your gown last night, for instance, such a lovely velvet. Did you notice anything unusual about it? A tear, perhaps, or something caught in the fabric?" Clara's hand paused on her teacup, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "No, nothing," she said quickly. "It was just my performance gown. Lydia takes such good care of it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes noting the slight tightening of Clara's fingers. The green thread in the alcove, she suspected, was no accident, and Clara's quick dismissal only deepened her curiosity as tea was served. Miss Marple observed the room's other occupants: Mrs. Hartnell, bustling with authority; Miss Finch, hovering at the edges with a tray of biscuits; and a few villagers come to offer condolences. Miss Finch's hands, Miss Marple noted, were never still, twisting her apron or adjusting her cap. When the dresser passed close, Miss Marple seized the moment. "Miss Finch," she said gently, "you must be so worried for Miss Vane. Were you with her in the vestry long before the concert?" Lydia's eyes darted to Clara, then back. "Not long, ma'am," she said. "I was arranging her music and checking her gown. She was in and out, tuning the violin." Her voice was steady, but her fingers betrayed her. Clutching the tray tightly, Miss Marple thanked her, her mind turning over the dresser's words. Lydia's presence in the vestry was confirmed, but her nervousness suggested more than mere concern for her employer. The rosary beads, perhaps left inadvertently, pointed to her. Yet the glitter and thread tied back to Clara. Miss Marple recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, when a young woman had enlisted a friend to hide her own jewellery, creating a drama to win sympathy. Clara, with her flair for performance, might have orchestrated a similar ruse, using Lydia as an unwitting accomplice, a knowing one. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the room for any further clues. She noted Clara's music case, resting on a side table, its leather unmarred, but its contents unexamined. She made a mental note to inspect it later, perhaps when Clara was distracted. Stepping into the corridor, she caught sight of Miss Finch slipping into Clara's room, her movements quick and furtive. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her steps silent on the thick carpet. Peering through the half-open door, she saw Lydia adjusting Clara's velvet gown, which hung on a stand. The dresser's hands lingered on the sleeves, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. Was Lydia checking for something or hiding it? She retreated before being seen, her mind alight with possibilities. The glitter trail, the velvet thread, the rosary beads all pointed to a plot centered in the vestry, with Clara at its heart. Yet Lydia's role remained elusive, her nervousness a puzzle piece that did not yet fit. Miss Marple recalled the village's penchant for drama, how a single spark could ignite a blaze of attention. "People," she murmured, stepping into the manor's garden, "do so love to be noticed," with the clues accumulating like stitches. In her knitting, she resolved to pursue the trail further, certain that the truth lay not in the villagers' wild theories, but in the quiet details only she had seen. Chapter 6. Questioning Miss Finch. The late afternoon light filtered through the latticed windows of St. Mary Mead, casting intricate patterns on the cobblestones as the village settled into the quiet hum of evening. The theft of Clara Vane's Stradivarius, now entering its second day, had woven itself into the fabric of daily life, each villager embellishing the tale with their own flourish of suspicion or intrigue. The Blue Boar buzzed with theories of highwaymen and jealous maestros, while the post office hummed with whispers of cursed instruments. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained apart from the clamour. Her mind a still pond where the ripples of evidence glitter, rosary beads, a velvet thread settled into a pattern only she could discern. The clues pointed not to the wild fantasies of the village, but to a more intimate deception, one centred, she suspected, on Clara Vane herself, with her dresser, Lydia Finch, as a pivotal figure yet to be fully understood. Miss Marple's morning had been spent in quiet reflection, her cottage a sanctuary where she sifted through the threads of the mystery. The glitter trail from Clara's pew to the vestry alcove, The amber rosary beads and the green velvet thread found behind the choir robes suggested a deliberate act, staged within the sacred confines of St. Anselm's Clara's polished distress. So, like a performance, hinted at a motive rooted in vanity or ambition. But Lydia's nervous demeanour and the beads tied her to the scene in ways Miss Marple could not yet unravel. To clarify the dresser's role, she resolved to visit Miss Finch at her modest cottage on the edge of the village, where the truth might reveal itself in the unguarded moments of a private conversation. The walk to Lydia's cottage was brisk, the autumn air sharp with the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. Miss Marple, her shawl drawn close, moved with the unhurried grace of one who knew the value of patience. The cottage, a neat affair with ivy clinging to its stone walls, stood apart from the village's heart, its solitude suiting Lydia's. Retiring nature, Miss Marple knocked softly, and the door opened to reveal Lydia Finch, her thin face pale and her eyes darting with the unease of a startled deer. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice catching. "What a surprise. Do come in." Her hands, ever restless, smoothed her apron as she stepped aside, revealing a tidy parlour furnished with a worn settee and a small table adorned with a vase of marigolds. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, its contents a comforting prop. "I won't keep you long, my dear," she began, her tone warm but laced with purpose. "This business with Miss Vane's violin has us all in a tizzy, and I thought you might have seen something that could help." Lydia's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their nervous twisting. "I've told the constable all I know," she said, her voice low. "I was in the vestry arranging Miss Vane's music and gown, but I didn't see anything unusual. It all happened so fast." Her eyes flicked to the window, as if expecting an interruption, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, filing it away with her other observations. "You're so devoted to Miss Vane," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly as she began a row. "It must be trying with all this upset. Were you with her long in the vestry before the concert?" Lydia hesitated, her fingers knotting in her apron. "Not long, ma'am. I was there to help with her gown. She's particular about the fit, you see. I laid out her music, checked the hem, and then she went to tune her violin. I stepped out to fetch her shawl from the nave, and that's when she called me back about the music order." Her words were measured, but there was a tremor beneath them, a crack in the facade that Miss Marple's keen ear detected. "And when you returned," Miss Marple pressed gently, "did you notice anything out of place? A sound, perhaps, or someone nearby?" Lydia's eyes widened, and she shook her head too quickly. "No, ma'am, nothing. It was just Miss Vane and me, and then she screamed about the violin." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of kindly concern, but her mind was alight with questions. Lydia's account aligned with Clara's, yet the dresser's nervousness suggested more than mere shock. The rosary beads, found in the vestry and alcove, pointed to her, for few in St. Mary Mead carried such items. "You're a woman of faith, aren't you, Miss Finch?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational. "I've seen you at evening prayers with your rosary." Lydia's face flushed, and she reached into her pocket, producing a string of amber beads, their glow warm in the fading light. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "It's a comfort, especially in times like these." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the rosary. "How lovely," she said, "though it looks as if you might have lost a bead or two. There were some found in the church, near the vestry." Lydia's hand froze, the beads slipping slightly in her grasp. "Lost," she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. I I must have dropped them. I was so flustered, helping Miss Vane. She fumbled with the rosary, counting the beads, and Miss Marple noted the absence of 2, matching those she had found. "That's easily done," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "In all the rush, things slip away. But I wondered, did you see Miss Vane do anything unusual in the vestry? She seemed so anxious, as Mr. Clement mentioned." Lydia's eyes darted to the floor, then back to Miss Marple. "She was nervous, ma'am, about the concert. She kept fussing with her sleeves, pulling at them as if they didn't sit right. I told her they were perfect, but she's particular. As I said, the words spilled out, a touch too fast, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the mention of Clara's sleeves. The glitter, she recalled, had been found on the pew and vestry frame, and the velvet thread in the alcove suggested Clara's gown had been there, perhaps in a moment of concealment. "You're very observant, Miss Finch," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "It's a great help. And did you notice anyone else in the church who might have lingered near the vestry?" Lydia shook her head, her fingers twisting the rosary. "No, ma'am. Just the choir boys and Mr. Grubb locking up earlier. It was all so busy." Miss Marple nodded, her smile unwavering, but her thoughts were racing. Lydia's nervousness, the missing beads, and her focus on Clara's sleeves painted a picture of a woman caught in a web she did not fully understand. Whether she was complicit, or merely a witness, Miss Marple could not yet say, but the dresser's unease was a clue in itself. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused by the table, her eyes falling on a small sewing basket. A spool of green thread, the same hue as Clara's gown, caught her attention, and she made a mental note. "Thank you, Miss Finch," she said. "You've been most helpful. Do take care, and if you remember anything else, you'll let me know, won't you?" Lydia nodded, her expression a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. And Miss Marple stepped into the evening chill, her mind alight with new connections. The walk back to the village gave her time to reflect. Lydia's rosary beads, missing too, that matched those found in the church, were no coincidence. They suggested she had been in the vestry and alcove, perhaps dropping them in haste or distraction. The mention of Clara's sleeves, combined with the glitter and velvet thread, pointed to the violinist's movements in those same spaces. Miss Marple recalled a case from years past, when a young woman had hidden her own locket to spark a village search, enlisting a timid friend to play a part in the drama. Clara, with her flair for the stage, might have orchestrated a similar ruse, using Lydia as a prop or an unwitting accomplice. The glitter, so out of place in St. Anselm's, suggested a theatrical element, perhaps a prop or costume Clara had handled before the concert. Her thoughts turned to the manor where Clara was staying, and she resolved to visit again, hoping to inspect the violinist's gown and music case. The green thread in the alcove was a tangible link to Clara, and the glitter, if found on her sleeves, would confirm her presence in the spaces where the clues had surfaced. Miss Marple also considered Lydia's role. The dresser's devotion to Clara was evident, but her nervousness hinted at knowledge she was reluctant to share. Had Clara instructed her to leave the beads as a distraction, or had Lydia dropped them by accident, caught up in her employer's scheme? The truth, Miss Marple felt, lay in the interplay between the two women, one a performer, the other a shadow in her orbit. As she reached the village green, Miss Marple paused, her gaze drifting to St. Anselm's, its spire piercing the twilight sky. The church, with its ancient stones and quiet sanctity, had been the stage for a drama far more intricate than a simple theft. She recalled the rustling Tommy Pierce had heard in the loft, the scuffle Mr. Tuttle had noted in the vestry, and the glitter trail that led from pew to alcove. Each clue was a note in a melody she was beginning to hear, and Clara Vane, she suspected, was its composer. People, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes twinkling, do so love to play their parts. With Lydia's words and the clues in her handkerchief, she set off for the manor, determined to pull the next thread in the mystery's delicate weave at the manor. Miss Marple was greeted by Mrs. Hartnell, whose tweed-clad presence filled the hall with authority. "Miss Marple, you're a godsend in this turmoil," she said, ushering her into the drawing-room. Clara was absent, resting upstairs, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity to inquire about her. "I do hope Miss Vane is bearing up," she said. "Might I see her music case? It could hold some clue to the violin's whereabouts." Mrs. Hartnell, distracted by her duties, waved a hand. "It's in her room, I believe. Miss Finch will show you." Lydia, summoned from the corridor, led Miss Marple upstairs. Her steps hesitant, in Clara's room, the music case sat on a dressing table, its leather gleaming in the lamplight. Miss Marple opened it, finding only sheet music and a tuning fork, but her eyes caught a faint shimmer on the inner lining, more glitter, the same silvery hue as in the church. "How curious," she said, her tone light. Lydia, hovering nearby, said nothing, but her hands twisted her apron fiercely. Miss Marple closed the case, her mind racing. The glitter, now linked to Clara's belongings, was no accident, and Lydia's silence spoke volumes. As she thanked the dresser and left the room, Miss Marple felt the puzzle's pieces drawing closer, with Clara at its centre and Lydia, perhaps, as her reluctant shadow. Chapter 7. The dressing chest, the twilight draped St. Mary Mead in a gentle veil, softening the outlines of its thatched cottages and casting long shadows across the village green. The theft of Clara Vane's Stradivarius, now the talk of every hearth and shop, had settled into the villagers' rhythm like a persistent tune, each retelling adding a new flourish of suspicion or drama. The villagers, from the blacksmith to the postmistress, spun tales of shadowy thieves and envious rivals, but Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her cottage with a pot of tea, saw through the gossip to the delicate threads of truth beneath. The amber rosary beads, the silvery glitter, the green velvet thread, and the faint shimmer in Clara's music case had woven a pattern that pointed not to an outsider but to the violinist herself, with her dresser, Lydia Finch, as a nervous figure on the fringes. Miss Marple's visit to Lydia had sharpened her suspicions, and now, with the clues aligning like stitches in her knitting, she resolved to pursue the trail to its source, the manor where Clara was staying, and the dressing chest that might hold the key to the mystery. The evening was cool, the air scented with the earthy temps of autumn leaves as Miss Marple made her way to Hartnell Manor, the grand house. Its stone facade, softened by ivy, glowed with lamplight, a beacon of wealth and order in the village's quiet sprawl. Mrs. Hartnell, a patron of the arts and Clara's host, had invited a small gathering to console the violinist, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence, was welcomed as a familiar face. Her knitting bag, a constant companion, lent her an air of harmlessness, but her eyes, bright and bird-like, missed nothing. The manor's hall was abuzz with murmured sympathies. The guests, Mrs. Price, Mr. Tuttle, and a few local worthies around Clara, who sat by the fire in a soft wool dress, her face a study in delicate sorrow. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her needles clicking softly as she observed the scene. Clara was the center of attention, her every gesture drawing eyes, the way she pressed a handkerchief to her lips, the faint tremor in her voice as she thanked her supporters. "You're all so kind," she said, her tone low but resonant, carrying across the room. "I don't know how I'll go on without my violin." It was more than an instrument, it was my heart. The words, delivered with a quiver, elicited sighs from Mrs. Price and a stern nod from Mrs. Hartnell, but Miss Marple noted the polish in Clara's delivery, the careful pause before my heart that seemed rehearsed for effect. She recalled a young actress from St. Mary Mead's amateur theatricals, who had staged a fainting spell to steal the stage, and the parallel was striking. Mrs. Hartnell, ever the commanding hostess, bustled about, ensuring teacups were filled and biscuits offered. "We mustn't let this tragedy dim Miss Vane's light," she declared, her tweed skirt rustling. "The concert will be rescheduled, and we'll find that violin, mark my words." Her confidence was met with murmurs of agreement, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The glitter trail from the church pew to the vestry alcove, the velvet thread, and the shimmer in Clara's music case suggested a plot centered on the violinist. Lydia's nervous account of Clara fussing with her sleeves had added a new thread, and Miss Marple suspected the key lay in Clara's belongings, perhaps in the very room where she dressed for the concert. Seizing an opportunity, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but deliberate. "Mrs. Hartnell," she said, her tone mild, "might I see Miss Vane's room? I believe she mentioned leaving some sheet music there, and it might help to review it for clues." Mrs. Hartnell, distracted by a guest's request for more tea, waved a hand. "Of course, Miss Marple. Lydia will show you upstairs." Lydia Finch, hovering near the door with a tray, started at her name, her thin face pulling. She led Miss Marple up the grand staircase, her steps hesitant, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. Miss Marple noted the dresser's unease, a silent confirmation that Lydia knew more than she had revealed. Clara's room was a haven of elegance, its walls adorned with faded tapestries, and its windows overlooking the manor's gardens. A large dressing chest, carved from dark oak, dominated one corner, its polished surface reflecting the lamplight. A velvet gowned Clara's performance dress, Miss Marple presumed hung on a stand, its green folds rich and unmarred. Lydia lingered by the door, her eyes darting to the chest, then away. "The music is on the table, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple nodded, but her attention was on the chest, its presence as commanding as a locked door in a mystery. Approaching the chest, she ran her fingers lightly over its surface, noting its intricate carvings and sturdy lock. "Such a fine piece," she said, her tone conversational. "Does Miss Vane keep her valuables here?" Lydia's hands stilled, her eyes wide. I suppose so, ma'am. Her jewellery, her music case. She's particular about her things." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes never leaving the chest. "And you help her organize it, of course. You must know it well." Lydia nodded, her fingers resuming their nervous dance. "Yes, ma'am, I keep it tidy for her." Her voice was strained, and Miss Marple sensed a truth hovering just out of reach. Pretending to examine the music on the table, Miss Marple moved closer to the chest, her movements casual but calculated. She noted a faint scratch near the lock, barely visible, as if someone had fumbled with a key or tool. "How curious," she murmured, loud enough for Lydia to hear. "This chest looks like it's seen some use." Lydia's breath caught, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple, undeterred, pressed a finger to the chest's edge, testing its weight. It was heavy, immovable without effort, but she noticed a slight gap at one side, where the wood seemed to give. With a gentle push, she felt a panel shift, revealing a hidden compartment to shallow space, just large enough for a violin. Her heart quickened, but she kept her expression serene. Peering inside, she saw a bundle wrapped in dark velvet, its shape unmistakable. She reached in, her fingers brushing the fabric, and felt the hard contours of a violin case. A faint shimmer of glitter clung to the velvet, matching the specs. Found in the church in Clara's music case, Miss Marple withdrew her hand, closing the compartment with care, her mind racing. The Stradivarius, hidden in plain sight, confirmed her suspicions. The theft was no theft at all, but a ruse, and Clara, with her flair for drama, was its architect. Lydia, watching from the doorway, shifted uneasily. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miss Marple turned, her smile gentle but piercing. "Quite all right, my dear. I was just admiring the craftsmanship. You've done well to keep Miss Vane's things in order." Lydia nodded, her relief palpable but tinged with anxiety, and Miss Marple made a mental note to watch her closely. The dresser's nervousness suggested she knew more than she admitted, perhaps even the hiding place of the violin, but whether she was complicit or merely caught in Clara's web remained unclear. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Clara still holding court, her sorrowful demeanour as polished as ever. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her eyes glistening, "have you found anything to help my poor violin?" The question was delivered with a touch of theatricality, and Miss Marple's response was measured. "I'm hopeful, my dear," she said. "Sometimes the things we think lost are closer than we realize." Clara's smile faltered, a fleeting crack in her composure, and Miss Marple noted it, her suspicions hardening into certainty. As the evening progressed, Mrs. Hartnell led the guests on a tour of the Manor's art collection, a distraction that allowed Miss Marple to linger near Clara. The violinist's conversation was charming, filled with anecdotes of her London triumphs, but there was a brittleness to her laughter, a tension in her posture that betrayed her calm. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the way Clara's hands moved, always adjusting her dress or touching her hair, as if guarding against some unseen flaw. The memory of the glitter on the velvet bundle and the thread in the alcove gnawed at her, linking Clara to the hidden violin in a way no outsider could have managed. She recalled a similar incident from years past, when a young woman in St. Mary Mead had hidden her own engagement ring to spark a village uproar, hoping to draw attention from a suitor's waning interest. The parallels were uncanny. Clara's fame, though bright, was not unassailable, and a dramatic theft could reignite the public's fascination. The glitter, Miss Marple suspected, had come from some prop or costume Clara had handled, perhaps a shawl or accessory not worn during the concert, but used in the act of hiding the violin. Lydia's role, whether as accomplice or unwitting witness, was secondary to Clara's orchestration, and the rosary beads, perhaps dropped in haste, were a misstep in an otherwise careful plan. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, offering to help Mrs. Hartnell with the teacups. "You're a treasure, Miss Marple," the hostess said, her voice warm but distracted. "This business with the violin has us all in a state." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to Clara, who was ascending the stairs with Lydia in tow. The dresser's head was bowed, her hands clutching her apron, and Miss Marple sensed a conversation brewing between the two women, one she would not be privy to, but could imagine. "People," she murmured, stacking a saucer, "do so love to create their own dramas." Stepping into the night, Miss Marple felt the weight of her discoveries. The violin, hidden in the dressing chest, was the keystone of the mystery, and Clara's fingerprints, literal and figurative, were all over it. The glitter, the thread, the beads all pointed to a performance staged for sympathy and attention, with Lydia as a reluctant player in the script. Miss Marple resolved to confront Clara soon, but first she needed to confirm Lydia's role and ensure the violin remained undisturbed. The manor, with its secrets tucked in oak and velvet, held the truth, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to bring it to light. Chapter 8. The motive unravelled. The evening had settled over St. Mary Mead like a velvet curtain, the village's lights twinkling against the deepening dusk. Hartnell Manor, its stone walls aglow with the warmth of lamplight, stood as a bastion of order amidst the chaos stirred by the theft of Clara Vane's Stradivarius. The mystery, now in its second day, had woven itself into the village's pulse, each conversation laced with speculation, from the wild tales of roving thieves to whispers of a scorned musician's revenge. Miss Jane Marple, however, saw through the fog of gossip to the clear threads of evidence: the amber rosary beads, the silvery glitter, the green velvet thread, and, most crucially, the violin itself, hidden in the secret compartment of Clara's dressing chest. These clues, like stitches in her knitting, had formed a pattern that pointed unerringly to the violinist, whose polished distress and theatrical presence suggested a performance far beyond the concert stage. With the truth within reach, Miss Marple resolved to confront Clara, to unravel the motive behind her elaborate ruse. The manor's drawing room was a scene of subdued elegance, its fire crackling softly as the last of the day's guests departed. Clara sat by the hearth, her wool dress replaced by a silk gown of deep indigo, its sheen catching the light like a stage costume. Mrs. Hartnell, ever the vigilant hostess, had retired to confer with her housekeeper, leaving Miss Marple and Clara alone, save for the distant clatter of teacups in the hall. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, settled into a chair opposite Clara, her demeanour as unassuming as ever, though her eyes held the keenness of a hawk. The air between them was charged, not with hostility, but with the quiet tension of a truth about to be revealed. "My dear," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but carrying the weight of certainty, "this business with your violin has caused quite a stir, but I think you know more about its disappearance than you've let on." Clara's hand paused on her teacup, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by a practiced smile. "Miss Marple, you're too kind to worry about me," she said, her tone light but strained. "I'm as baffled as anyone who could do such a thing." The words were smooth, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of Clara's fingers, the subtle shift in her posture, as if bracing for a storm. Miss Marple's needles clicked, a soothing rhythm that belied the precision of her words. "You've always loved the spotlight, haven't you, my dear?" she said, her gaze steady. "And you're very good at it, drawing every eye, holding every heart. But fame, I've noticed, is a fickle thing. It fades, doesn't it, unless one finds a way to keep it burning." Clara's smile faltered, a crack in her composure, and Miss Marple pressed on, her voice gentle but unrelenting. "I found your violin, you see, in the dressing chest upstairs, tucked in a hidden compartment, wrapped in velvet with a touch of glitter, the same glitter I saw on the pew where you sat, on the vestry doorframe, and in your music case, and there was a thread from your gown in the alcove, where another rosary bead was found. It's all rather neat, isn't it? Almost like a script." Clara's teacup clattered against its saucer, her eyes wide with a mix of defiance and fear. "You're..." "Mistaken, Miss Marple," she said, her voice rising. "I would never. My violin is my life. Why would I hide it?" But the tremor in her words betrayed her, and Miss Marple's expression softened, not with pity but with understanding. "Oh, my dear," she said, "I think you know why. You've tasted fame, and it's a heady thing, but it slips away. A stolen violin, a dramatic lost it, makes the world look at you again, doesn't it? The papers, the public, all talking of Clara Vane, the tragic genius. It's a performance, and you played it beautifully." The room seemed to shrink, the fires crackle, the only sound as Clara's facade crumbled. Her shoulders slumped, and she pressed her hands to her face, her breath catching. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice raw. "I was losing them. London, the critics, they were looking elsewhere, to younger players, newer stars. I needed something to make them see me again." She looked up, her eyes glistening, not with the practiced tears of the church, but with a desperate honesty. "I didn't mean for it to go so far. I was going to find the violin after the concert, let it be a miracle, a story to tell. But then everyone believed it was stolen, and I couldn't stop it." Miss Marple nodded, her needles still, her mind piecing together the final threads. "And the rosary beads?" she asked. "They belong to Miss Finch, don't they?" Clara's eyes darted away, then back. "Lydia didn't know," she said quickly. "I took her rosary from her bag when she wasn't looking. I thought, if someone found them, it would confuse things, point away from me. I dropped them in the vestry and the alcove, where I hid the violin before moving it to the chest." Her voice faltered, and she added, "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be seen." The confession, though quiet, filled the room, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for the young woman, whose ambition had outstripped her judgment. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, when a girl had staged a theft of her own brooch to win back a suitor's attention, only to be undone by her own carelessness. Clara's plan, more elaborate, bore the same hallmark of vanity, and the glitter likely from a shawl or prop used in her preparations had been her undoing. "And the glitter?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle. "It came from something you handled, didn't it? Not your gown, but perhaps a scarf or a stage prop." Clara nodded, her face flushed. "A shawl I wore while practicing in London. It's covered in that wretched glitter. I didn't realize it would cling so." Miss Marple leaned back, her mind clear. The puzzle was complete. Clara had hidden the violin in the vestry alcove during her tuning, leaving the rosary beads to mislead, then moved it to the Manor's dressing chest under cover of the chaos. The glitter, a careless trace from her shawl, had marked her path, and Lydia, though innocent, had been a convenient scapegoat. "You've been very clever," Miss Marple said, "but not quite clever enough. The truth has a way of shining through like light through a crack." Clara's eyes filled, but she said nothing. Her silence an admission of defeat. The sound of footsteps broke the moment, and Mrs. Hartnell entered, her tweed rustling. "Miss Marple, you're still here," she said, oblivious to the tension. "Clara, my dear, you must rest. This ordeal has been too much." Clara rose, her composure returning like a mask, and excused herself, casting a final glance at Miss Marple, one of mingled gratitude and shame. Miss Marple remained, her thoughts turning to the next steps. The violin, safely hidden, could be found without exposing Clara's deception, preserving the village's peace while ensuring justice was served in its own quiet way. She recalled Lydia's nervousness, the dresser's unwitting role in Clara's scheme, the rosary beads taken without Lydia's knowledge, explained her anxiety, for she must have noticed their absence and feared suspicion. Miss Marple resolved to speak with her, to ease her mind and ensure she bore no blame. The village, with its love of drama, would relish a happy resolution, and Clara's donation to the church, as Miss Marple would gently suggest, would soothe ruffled feathers. She thought of Constable Hurst, who would claim credit for the violin's recovery, and smiled faintly. Men, she murmured, do so love their triumphs. Rising, Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and stepped into the hall, where Lydia was clearing the tea things. "Miss Finch," she said softly, "might I have a word?" Lydia started, her hands trembling, but Miss Marple's smile was reassuring. "You have nothing to fear, my dear. The violin is safe, and I know you had no part in its disappearance." Lydia's eyes widened, relief flooding her face. "Oh, ma'am, I was so worried. My rosary, I couldn't find it, and I thought—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple patted her hand. "It's all right. Things are often not what they seem, but they come right in the end." As she left the manor, the night air cool against her face, Miss Marple felt the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. The glitter trail, the velvet thread, the rosary beads all had led to Clara's desperate bid for attention, a performance as calculated as her music. The village would move on, its gossip turning to new scandals, and Clara, chastened, might find a quieter path to fame. Miss Marple recalled the many dramas she had witnessed in St. Mary Mead, each a reminder of human frailty and the power of quiet observation. People, she said to herself, her eyes twinkling, do so love to play their parts. But the truth always takes the stage. Chapter 9. The Resolution. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a serene clarity. The mist curling gently from the meadows and the first rays of sunlight gilding the spire of St. Anselm's Church. The village, though still abuzz with the drama of Clara Vane's stolen Stradivarius, had begun to settle into a rhythm of hopeful anticipation. For word had spread that the violin might soon be recovered. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her cottage window with a cup of tea, watched the village awaken, her mind as sharp as the morning light. The pieces of the mystery, the amber rosary beads, the silvery glitter, the green velvet thread, and the violin, hidden in Clara's dressing chest, had fallen into place, revealing a scheme orchestrated by the violinist herself to reclaim the spotlight. Clara's confession, delivered in the quiet of the manor's drawing room, had confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions, and now, with the truth in hand, she faced the delicate task of resolving the matter without shattering the villagers' harmony. Miss Marple's approach, as always, was one of quiet pragmatism. She had no wish to expose Clara's deception publicly, for such a scandal would ripple through St. Mary Mead like a stone through a pond, disrupting its delicate balance. Instead, she envisioned a resolution that would restore the violin, soothe the village's ruffled feathers, and allow Clara to make amends without losing all dignity. The violinist's motive fear of fading fame, though misguided, was human, and Miss Marple, with her deep understanding of human frailty, preferred restoration over retribution. Her plan, carefully considered, involved a discreet recovery of the violin and a gentle nudge toward Clara to contribute to the church, a gesture that would satisfy the villagers' sense of justice. Her first task was to ensure the violin's discovery in a way that deflected suspicion from Clara. Miss Marple made her way to Hartnell Manor, her shawl drawn against the morning chill, her knitting bag a familiar prop. The manor was quiet, its grandeur softened by the early hour, and Mrs. Hartnell greeted her with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Miss Marple, you're up early," she said, her tweed-clad figure bustling into the hall. "We're all still reeling from this dreadful affair. Have you heard any news of the violin?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes twinkling with purpose. "I have a feeling, Mrs. Hartnell, that we may find it soon. Might I have a word with Miss Finch? I believe she could help." Lydia Finch, summoned from the kitchen, appeared with her usual nervous air, her hands twisting her apron as she faced Miss Marple. The dresser's relief at being cleared of suspicion had not fully dispelled her anxiety, and Miss Marple's presence seemed to unsettle her further. "Miss Finch," Miss Marple began, her tone soothing, "you've been such a help to Miss Vane, and I think you might assist us again. I'd like to look at her dressing chest once more. There's a chance something was overlooked." Lydia's eyes widened, but she nodded, leading Miss Marple upstairs with a hesitancy that suggested she sensed the weight of the moment in Clara's room. The dressing chest stood as imposing as ever, its oak surface gleaming in the morning light. Miss Marple, with Lydia hovering nearby, approached the chest and pressed the hidden panel she had discovered the previous evening. The compartment opened with a soft click, revealing the velvet-wrapped bundle. Lydia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Is that—" she began, but Miss Marple's gentle gesture silenced her. "Yes, my dear," she said. "It seems the violin was misplaced, not stolen. A fortunate oversight, don't you think?" She lifted the bundle, unwrapping the velvet, to reveal the Stradivarius, its polished wood glowing with an almost ethereal beauty. A faint shimmer of glitter clung to the velvet, a final echo of the trail that had led Miss Marple to the truth. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, her relief palpable. "Oh, ma'am, I didn't know. I thought perhaps I'd failed Miss Vane somehow." Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice kind but firm. "You've done nothing wrong, Miss Finch, but I think it best if we let the constable find the violin. It will spare everyone unnecessary questions." Lydia nodded, her loyalty to Clara warring with her gratitude, and Miss Marple instructed her to fetch Mrs. Hartnell, leaving the chest open for the discovery. Mrs. Hartnell, upon seeing the violin, exclaimed with delight, her voice echoing through the manor, "A miracle, Miss Marple, you're a marvel." She summoned Constable Hurst, who arrived, with his usual bluster, his moustache bristling with self-importance. Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, suggested that the chest had been overlooked in the initial search, perhaps due to its hidden compartment. "It's easily done," she said, her tone mild. "In all the excitement, things are missed." The constable, eager to claim credit, agreed, declaring the violin's recovery a triumph of his diligence. "I knew it couldn't have gone far," he said, inspecting the instrument with a proprietary air. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing, content to let him bask in his imagined victory. With the violin restored, the villagers' mood lifted like the mist from the meadows. Word spread quickly, and by midday, St. Anselm's was once again the centre of attention, this time for celebration rather than scandal. Mr. Clement, his round face beaming, announced that the Vespers concert would be rescheduled for the following evening, with Clara Vane to perform as planned. The villagers, ever forgiving, flocked to the church to prepare, their chatter now filled with excitement rather than suspicion. Miss Marple, however, had one final task, to ensure Clara understood the need for amends. She found the violinist in the manor's garden, seated on a stone bench beneath a willow, her indigo gown a stark contrast to the green around her. Clara's face, though composed, bore the weight of her confession, and she rose as Miss Marple approached, her eyes wary. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "you've found it, haven't you?" Miss Marple nodded, settling beside her, her knitting bag at her side. Yes, my dear, and it's back where it belongs. But I think, you know, this mustn't happen again. Clara's hands twisted in her lap, her gaze fixed on the ground. I was foolish, she said. I thought a story like this would keep me in the light. I didn't mean for it to hurt anyone. Miss Marple's expression softened, her understanding, tempered by firmness. Fame is a fleeting thing, my dear, and it's never worth such games. But you have a chance to make it right. The church could use some help. Roof has been leaking for years, and a contribution would go far to soothe the village's feelings. Clara looked up, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. You won't tell them? She asked, a note of hope in her voice. Miss Marple shook her head. There's no need. The violin is found, and the village is content. But a gesture of goodwill would speak louder than words. Clara nodded, her relief palpable. I'll do it, she said. I have savings from my concerts. I'll give what I can to the church. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly as she began a new row. That's wise, my dear. And perhaps, in time, you'll find that your music is enough to hold the spotlight. Clara's smile was tentative, but genuine, and Miss Marple sensed a shift in her, a chastening that might guide her future choices. The rescheduled concert, held the following evening, was a triumph. St. Anselm's was packed, the air thick with anticipation as Clara took the chancel, her Stradivarius gleaming under the candlelight. Her performance was sublime, each note resonating with a clarity that hushed the congregation. Miss Marple, seated in her usual pew, watched, with quiet satisfaction, noting the genuine emotion in Clara's playing, free of the artifice that had marked her earlier actions. The village, unaware of the truth, applauded warmly, their forgiveness as generous as their earlier suspicions. After the concert, Clara announced a donation to the church's restoration fund, a sum generous enough to prompt gasps and murmurs of approval. Mr. Clement, overcome with gratitude, praised her generosity, while Constable Hurst, standing proudly by the door, muttered about his role in the violin's recovery. Miss Marple, slipping out into the night, smiled to herself, her thoughts drifting to the many dramas she had witnessed in St. Mary Mead. Each, in its way, was a lesson in human nature, and Clara's was no exception. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her cat tuppence purring at her feet. The rosary beads, glitter, and velvet thread, though no longer needed, remained in her handkerchief, a reminder of the puzzle she had unravelled. She thought of Lydia Finch, whose innocence had been preserved, and Clara, whose ambition had been tempered by a gentle reckoning. The village would move on, its gossip turning to new tales, and Miss Marple would watch, as always, from her quiet corner. People, she said softly, her eyes twinkling, do so love their stories. But the truth has a way of finding its own harmony. With a final stitch, she set her knitting aside, content that St. Mary Mead's peace was restored, at least until the next mystery stirred its tranquil surface.